At the beginning of the program, the first hour, we will talk with Professor Norman Finkelstein about a couple of his books and a couple of opinions that are being thrown out there about his latest book, which is the title of it is Beyond, and I'm going to have him help me pronounce that one, Chazba, I believe. And I believe we do have the professor with us. Professor, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Welcome to the program, sir. Appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Okay. Professor Finkelstein, now how do you, the Beyond Chazba, is it?
No, chutzpah.
What is it?
It's not so easy to pronounce. I can't give you an equivalent. It's chutzpah.
Chutzpah, okay. We do have a picture of that book, if we can throw the on the screen, the picture of Professor Finkelstein book. Now, Professor, can you just briefly tell us a little bit about yourself and what, I know you are a professor of political science at DePaul University in Chicago. Just tell us a little bit about your activism.
I've always been at the left end of the political spectrum. In my youth, I was more involved in issues pertaining to the war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement. Later in life, probably beginning in the early 1980s, I became involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that's pretty much where my public political life has been the past 25 years.
Okay. Now, you are the son of a Holocaust survivors from, actually your parents were from the Warsaw Ghetto?
Both of my parents grew up in Warsaw, Poland from 1939 to 1943. They were in the Warsaw Ghetto, and after the ghetto was emptied out, my father was in Auschwitz concentration camp, was on the Auschwitz Death March, liberated by the Americans. My mother was in Majdanek concentration camp, then 2 slave labor camps, and was liberated by the Russians.
Now, your parents did experience the Holocaust, but what I understand that you do have a problem with the way the Holocaust is being handled by I guess by some of the Jewish organizations, and you even wrote a book about it called The Holocaust Industry. Can you tell me a little bit about that book?
The book came out in 2000. Basically, it's not about the Nazi Holocaust. I don't claim to be I don't claim to have the professional expertise to write in any substantial way the Nazi Holocaust. I start from the premise, which I don't think is open to dispute among rational human beings, that the Nazi Holocaust did happen. It was a colossal infliction of colossal suffering on Jews and also other groups of people. Probably on the order of 5 to 6 million Jews were systematically exterminated in the course of the Nazi final solution. Those are the facts. As I say, to my knowledge, no rational person disputes them, but I don't really discuss them in my book. My book is more concerned with ways in which the Nazi Holocaust has been exploited by Jewish organizations for political gain, mostly to deflect criticism of Israel, and also for financial gain.
When you receive the fleshlight, it will arrive in this discreetly marked plain brown box.
Called Holocaust compensation, which was really a blackmail
After you've removed the product
by
from the
Jewish
packaging,
organizations to shake down European
unscrew the
countries.
cap.
Now, why we don't see a lot of people talking like that, Professor?
And remove the
Well,
super
most
skin
people
insert.
are ignorant on the topic, and there's a vast lobby which gets lots of mileage from distorting the lessons of the Nazi Holocaust, and it's a very valuable weapon to silence criticism of Israel and Israeli supporters around the world. So it's not surprising that weapon is wielded, and those who wield it are very possessive about it.
Okay. But actually, the Holocaust became more of a money-making for some of these Jewish organizations. That's what you're saying?
I don't think it started out as a money-making thing. I think basically it starts up in the late 1960s, the Holocaust industry, and its main use was to deflect criticism of Israel by invoking the Nazi Holocaust and the unique suffering, or was claimed to be the unique suffering of Jews, in order to justify policies which under any other circumstances would have been unjustifiable.
Now, you mentioned, and this is not really the topic of tonight, but I just want to hear it from you, because I've heard it from a lot of people that they are disputing the number. Just very briefly, and we're going to jump into your books. You mentioned the 6 million. Now, how is that? Okay, you said it was facts, that 6 million. How did...
I'd say among those who are knowledgeable on the topic, the figure is put at between 5 and 6 million, probably closer to 5 million, maybe 5.2, 5.3 million, according to the best historians on the topic. But it seems to hardly make a difference if it's 4.5 million or 6 million. We're dealing with quite colossal numbers, and it barely makes a difference what the actual number is once we've reached that range.
Okay. Well, of course, I mean, definitely, it doesn't really make much difference when you go above, any number, because a loss of life is a loss of life. And there is a point, legitimately one can make the argument that there is a point where quantity turns into quality, and when you have crossed a certain threshold, and once you're talking about the millions, you're talking about a phenomenon that's on a different scale. I mean, that's pretty obvious. There's a difference between there's plainly a difference between blowing up a house and blowing up the World Trade Center. In each case, it's a loss of life and there's a loss of property, but there's a difference of scale there, which any rational person would see. Okay, let's jump into a topic which is it's been for all of a sudden, anti-Semitism has been in the news a lot. Can you define for me what you think anti-Semitism is?
Well, I don't think the issue is not so much what anti-Semitism is. The issue is whether, when people claim there's a resurgent anti-Semitism, are they really talking about anti-Semitism? The first point to make is that these claims of a resurgent or a new anti-Semitism, they appear roughly every 15 years. American Jewish organizations and apologists for Israel crank up the anti-Semitism machine and claim there's a new anti-Semitism. So if you look back, say, in 1974, the Anti-Defamation League, the main Jewish so-called defense organization, the heads of it, fellows named Arnold Forster and Benjamin Epstein, they put out a book called The New Anti-Semitism. And the thesis was that the world was rife. There was a rampant new anti-Semitism throughout the world. And then in the early 1980s, the new head of the Anti-Defamation League, a fellow named Nathan Perlmutter, and his wife Ruth Ann Perlmutter, they put out a book called The Real Anti-Semitism, and the thesis was that there's a new anti-Semitism in the world. And then when Abraham Foxman, the current hoodlum who heads the ADL, he put out a book a couple of years ago entitled Never Again, claiming that there was a new anti-Semitism. Basically, it's a prop of the Jewish organizations to deflect criticism of Israel by pretending that, number one, everybody who criticizes Israel is an anti-Semite, and that all criticism of Israel is motivated by anti-Semitism. There's not a scratch of evidence that there's a new anti-Semitism in the world. There's not a scratch of evidence that Jews are facing any particular danger. What there is and what you can document is that there is considerable hostility to Israeli policy in the occupied territories, and that hostility is being interpreted by Jewish organizations as anti-Semitism.
But anti-Semitism is a very powerful weapon, though, that Israel is using, and it's...
yeah, it's a powerful weapon because they use the weapon of anti-Semitism to claim that if you're an anti-Semite, you're therefore advocating another Holocaust. So everything eventually comes back to the Holocaust, and the Holocaust is the big weapon, and the anti-Semitism is you can call it an attendant weapon. The weapon, a second weapon, which is used basically in tandem with the first weapon. So when you hear you're an anti-Semite, it's basically saying you support the extermination of the Jews, you support the Holocaust. That's the sort of reasoning that's used in order to terrify any critics of Israel and any critics of American Jewry generally into silence.
But actually the media is helping Israel and its allies or its supporters into actually making that point, aren't they?
Well, yeah, the media supports the U.S.-Israeli alliance. The media is basically more or less organs of ruling elite opinion, and the ruling elite opinion is clearly supports that U.S.-Israeli alliance.
Now, why do you think the media is doing that?
Why do I think what?
Why do you think the media is exploiting the anti-Semitism and
well, because
actually...
it's a useful weapon for preventing reasonable criticism of Israel, because the media basically reflects ruling elite opinion, and ruling elite support the U.S.-Israeli alliance. It's not really much more complicated than that.
Okay, so what you're saying is the media is controlled?
I say the media generally, follows the opinions and the perspectives of those who hold power. Otherwise, the media would be saying that George Bush is a murderer and a buffoon and all the rest. They don't say it, even though most of the world thinks it, because that's their president.
Now, some countries do have laws on the books against anti-Semitism, and these laws actually, if you criticize Israel, you will be labeled as an anti-Semite, and actually you might, some criminal charges might come upon you. Now, in the United States, the State Department had listed few of these things, and some of them just criticizing Israel or talking about the Jewish control of the media, or talking about the Jewish control of the banking system, or criticizing anything Jewish and anything has to do with Israel would be considered a crime. Now, there is a bill in the Congress as we speak that would probably do just that. Do you think we do need an anti-Semitic bill here to protect Israel?
I'm not really familiar with the bill. Some people have mentioned it to me. I'm not familiar with its content. I generally believe in the widest possible freedom of expression, no curbs put on the right to speak. So I don't think, in this general principle, I'm against the bill, any kind of curbs on speech, or except at a very extreme limit, the classical case being incitement to riot. But short of those classic and pretty narrow cases, I support the widest possible rights to speech. I think that's the only way the truth ever comes out, when everybody's allowed to criticize everyone else. And the more narrow question of a bill to protect Jews, I think, is sheer nonsense. There's no danger whatsoever in the United States to Jews, and there are many other groups. If you were to propose a bill against inciting hatred of Arabs, I could see a point to it, because there is a problem in the United States on that score. But a bill to prevent incitement of hatred of Jews is preposterous. Jews are very secure in the United States. No dangers are posed to them. The bill is simply another, having not read it, I'll assume that it's simply another effort to curb criticism of Israel.
How much money so far has the Jewish organizations received or taken from Germany due to the Holocaust?
Well, I think that's it's not an easy question to answer. Germany has paid out about, over the past 50 years, it's paid out about $100 billion in compensation and reparation. Most of the money it's paid out directly from its coffers to survivors of the Nazi Holocaust and survivors from Germany who made it over during the 1930s. In my opinion, all of that money was legitimately received by those who were deserving of it, and I don't in any way quarrel with that. But then there was a sizable chunk, certainly in the billions of dollars, which wasn't given directly by the German government to the Jewish survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, but rather was given to Jewish organizations who were supposed to distribute it to the survivors. That money has been effectively stolen by these Jewish organizations. They're crooks, and they use the Nazi Holocaust as a extortion racket to extract money for their own coffers.
Now, who is a Holocaust survivor? Is it any Jew who lived during that era, or just the ones who were in the concentration camps?
The usual definition, the one that was just taken for granted during the years after the Nazi Holocaust, was that a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust was somebody who experienced the concentration camps, the slave labor camps, the ghettos. Those were considered Nazi Holocaust survivors. But if you, for example, managed to make it over to the United States, someone like Henry Kissinger, or you managed to make it over to the Soviet Union, someone like former Israeli Prime Minister Begin, you were not considered a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. Rather the contrary, you were considered somebody who managed to escape the Nazi Holocaust. This revision of the definition of who is a survivor in more recent years has been for strictly financial reasons. Namely, if you can inflate the number of survivors, you can demand more money for compensation.
Okay. Professor, we're going to go to the phones for a second, then we'll come back and talk about your latest book. We're going to Marco on one. Go ahead, Marco.
Hello, fellas. A very interesting program. I have a question for the professor. There is a well-known, well-published, very popular writer on the internet. His name is Henry Makow. And I believe he lost both of his sets of grandparents in the Holocaust, and he is a Jew. And he's very critical of the whole Holocaust industry, as the professor is. And in addition, he's very opposed to Zionism in general. And he wrote in one of his pieces once a quote that I would like to read to the professor, and then I would like to get his input on it. And what Henry says is, quote, "In most cases, anti-Semitism, old or new, is not an irrational hatred or sickness in the Gentile soul. It is a healthy defense mechanism of mainly Christian and Muslim nations, cultures, races, and religions that are threatened by the gradual and insidious process of extinction under the Zionist agenda." And I would just like to get the professor's comments on that, and I'll hang up. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's a totally sick statement. I very much doubt this person had family members who died in the Nazi Holocaust. There are too many people on all ends of the spectrum who are trying to bolster their credentials, their, as it were, Jewish credentials or Holocaust credentials, to promote pretty sick agendas. I include in that Jewish organizations as well as the person who you're quoting. The very kind of language that's used is, to my thinking, an indication of a mind that's severely in need of therapy.
Okay. Now, for your, let's jump into your latest book. Now, you sent an email to the dean of Harvard Law School, and in that email you said, "I'm right now completing a book manuscript for University of California Press, a large part of which is devoted to Alan Dershowitz. I spoke today to Sarah Rimmer, who informed me that Harvard completely exonerated Dershowitz of all plagiarism charges. My book will devote a full chapter to conclusively documenting Dershowitz's plagiarism. I will also demonstrate that he almost certainly did not write the book and perhaps did not even read it prior to publication." Now, I know there was a lot of pressure that was put on you and on California Press to actually remove everything about Dershowitz in there. Did you do that?
Well, the press was not pressuring me to remove everything on Dershowitz. There were issues relating to the question of plagiarism. The bulk of my book has nothing to do with plagiarism. Plagiarism is simply an appendix 1 to the book. The bulk of the book has to do with Israel's human rights record, and Alan Dershowitz's falsification of that record in his book, The Case for Israel, assuming for the sake of argument that it is his book. His falsification of Israel's human rights record. Issues came up on the question of his having plagiarized and also on his authorship of the book. In my opinion, the final version of the book, the one which is currently in bookstores, does not in any significant way change or alter the charges as I presented them in the original manuscript.
So you still think that Dershowitz probably did not write that book?
I don't think he wrote the book, and I still am the opinion he probably hadn't even read much of it, if any of it, when I debated him.
Now were you forced to change some of that in your book?
I have a statement posted on my website, which was timed for publication of the book, in which I go through these issues, and I stated categorically, and I cite the pages in my text, that on none of the substantive issues have I retrieved 1,000th part of 1 inch. What I said originally is what's in the final version.
Okay. Now, I did read some of his actually attacks on you, and to tell you the truth, well, let's not call them attacks, but let's just say what he had wrote about you, defending I guess what he had said. And to me, after I read some of this stuff, I don't understand how could someone make these statements, and he's a professor at Harvard Law School. Now, he did say, well, you said that at a conference in Israel attended by Prime Minister Sharon, Dershowitz declared that Israel was not at all bound by international law. Now, listen to his defense. And to me, it's like he actually, when he defended himself, he actually, made it more of an accusation to himself. I guess they do say the worst enemy is, the mistake is an attorney defending himself. Alan Dershowitz says, Israelis are obliged to follow the rule of law that exists in the democracy called Israel, the way I'm obliged to follow the rule of law in a democracy called the United States. International law is not democratic. Your moral obligation to comply with the letter of the law of the rule of international law is voluntary. Isn't this saying exactly what you were saying about him?
Well, yeah, I think many of his defenses are, he has, I think, 7 or 9 examples of how I'm factually wrong, and the evidence he presents in most, but not all of those cases, simply demonstrate that I was factually correct. And then that's an example where exactly what I wrote is exactly what he said. There are other examples where Dershowitz has I guess you would call it a stock in one of Dershowitz's stocks in trade is to make 2 statements, one extreme, another less extreme, and then when he's pinned down on the extreme version of the statement, he cites the not extreme version. So let's take the example of Professor Dershowitz's views on demolition of homes. In one article that he wrote for the Jerusalem Post, an Israeli right-wing newspaper, he says that he advocates, quote, the automatic destruction of a Palestinian village after each terrorist attack. And he said there will be no discretion. He says that they'll have 24 hours to evacuate, and if they don't evacuate, the village will be automatically destroyed, presumably with the people still inside. There will be no discretion. And when I quoted that in my text, his refutation was to cite another text where he states that all I was talking about was a few empty houses. Well, first of all, blowing up a few empty houses is nonetheless a violation of international law. But leaving that aside, his statement about the automatic destruction of a Palestinian village, that's in print, and that was what I cited. But he cites something else, and he does that quite often. Another example he gave is the question of the question of torture of alleged terrorists. And in the statement I cited, he states that he supports excruciating torture, such as shoving sterilized needles under your fingernails. And when I pin him down on that, he just switches the text and he says, but look what I wrote in this text. And then the text he cites is a much milder version of the original. That's one of his tactics. Hopefully readers won't be so gullible. But as you correctly point out, in other cases, what he cites simply confirms what I wrote.
Exactly. I mean, I read all his points, and in every point, what he states actually defends you. I guess I don't know if Harvard Law School to be that stupid in my mind. I don't know. For sure, I will not have him for an attorney if I'm in trouble. You know, OJ did pretty good with him.
No, I think he's just the right attorney if you're in trouble. If you have no interest in truth and you simply want to get your client off, and in fact, if you're a guilty client, you're probably in good hands with Dershowitz, because his forte is getting people guilty of sin off. So if you're guilty, I would say go to him. If you've committed a colossal crime and you're guilty, for sure go to him. If you're interested in being acquitted because what you're saying is true, then he's not the right attorney. He's a good attorney if you're a mass murderer and a liar.
Now, also he states that you wrongly accused him of saying that the Jewish settlers have a right to live in the West Bank and Gaza. And this is what he says. He says, my opposition to the settlements deep in the West Bank and Gaza is not based on the law. Indeed, I have argued that Jews should have the right to live anywhere in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, he's saying exactly what you're saying about him, and he thinks he's defending himself and everyone.
Right, well, and he goes on to say explicitly, I do also believe Jews should have the right to live anywhere, but that's not what the issue was. The question is whether Jewish settlers have a legal right to live in occupied territory. That's a totally separate issue. Anyone should have the right to immigrate and emigrate from any country. That seems to me elementary. If our society were to discriminate against Jews, Gentiles, blacks or Asians in its immigration laws, we would all be appalled by it. But that's not the issue here. The issue is Palestine is occupied, or the West Bank and Gaza under international law are occupied territories. And under international law, there's an absolute prohibition on transferring members from the occupier country to the occupied land. That's an absolute taboo. And that's the only relevant issue. And he states that Jewish settlers have a legal right to settle in the occupied territories. And I said there's no one, as far as I know, under international law, who upholds that. No one who specializes in international law who would agree with him on that statement.
Okay, we're going to go back to the phone. Scott on line 1. Go ahead, Scott.
Hello. I just wanted to call in and ask a question to the professor. First of all, I first became aware of Professor Finkelstein gave a talk at the Art Institute of Chicago. After September 11th, I started to try and understand why the majority of the world viewed the United States with such disdain. I started reading up on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and then I heard Professor Finkelstein speak at the Art Institute of Chicago. He made a lot of sort of very solid points. I then went and bought his book, Vision and Reality of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, read it. I've read the Holocaust Industry. I've also watched his debate 2 or 3 times on Democracy Now! I'm sort of, I salute his work. He does a lot of good work.
Scott, you have a question?
Yes. Concerning the Gaza disengagement, the numbers sort of speak volumes. 9,000 people were evacuated, the Israeli settlers. However, there are 240,000 illegal Israeli settlers in the West Bank. I would not go so far to say as the disengagement was tokenism, but it seems like Israel's efforts since the disengagement of Gaza have been to reinforce their fortification of the West Bank. Can I get your comment on that?
Thank you.
Well, there are a couple of issues here. First of all, there's been a redeployment of Israelis in the occupied territories. There's been no end to the occupation in Gaza. The fact of the matter is all human rights organizations point out, under international law, so long as Israel maintains control of entry and exit, the coastlines, the airspace, so long as it controls the flow of goods and labor in and out of Gaza, it remains under international law an occupying power. The principle is pretty straightforward, and any rational person can understand it. If you take the keys to jail cells and you throw them to the prisoners and allow them to exit from the cells, but the jailers then shut tight the gates of the prison and redeploy outside the prison, it's true that the prisoners are no longer in their cells, but they're still in a jail. And that principle, which any person can understand, is applicable as well on the principles of occupation. The Gazans have now been freed from their cells and are able to move freely inside the prison, but that doesn't change the fact that it's a prison. That's on that side. On the other side, on the question of the West Bank, there are approximately 400,000 settlers, 200,000 the West Bank, and about 220,000 surrounding and inside East Jerusalem. Those settlers are all illegal under international law, and the likelihood is that they are going to continue to stay there.
Okay. We're going to go to line 2 with Freedom. Go ahead, Freedom.
I have to ask this to Mr. Finkelstein, because this has been bothering me now for years and years, and this may be my first time to ask the question. The most hated people by the Nazis were the gypsies in Europe and the European Jews, apparently. Now, they both were put in concentration camps in Auschwitz and Dachau and Bergen-Belsen. They both were slaughtered by the German soldiers, but European Jewry had a chance to go to Palestine. Now, why couldn't they find a place for the European gypsies to go and start their homeland? Is it possible, Mr. Finkelstein, that there was a double standard there? Could you please explain what was the difference between the way the gypsies were treated, who were just as hated by the Nazis, and the way the European Jews were treated? Please explain that, and thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, it's no question in my mind that both the gypsy population and the Jewish population were targeted for extermination. I wouldn't say that they were hated in the same way. They were hated for different reasons. In the case of the gypsies, they were viewed with sheer contempt as being somehow subhuman, just a human refuse. In the case of Jews, there was a different attitude. There was a view of Jews as somehow being demonic and satanic and having huge amounts of power and wealth. They were the wire pullers who controlled the world. The Gypsies was something different. I think nobody saw them as a satanic and demonic power. They were just looked at as human refuse, garbage. In terms of their treatment by the Nazis, there were some differences, in my opinion, rather trivial, the kinds of differences. There are, I guess you could say, significant differences in the absolute numbers killed. In the case of Gypsies, the figure probably comes to about I guess a fair estimate, though it's a matter of dispute, probably just cutting it down the middle, about 250,000 or 300,000 Gypsies were exterminated by the Nazis. Otherwise, the difference in treatment, obviously there was nowhere for the Gypsies to go because there's no Gypsy homeland.
Okay. We're going to go to Chris on 3. Go ahead, Chris.
Dr. Finkelstein?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, my question, Dr. Finkelstein, I first became aware of you, sir, in about 2002 after I read the book, The Holocaust Industry. I distinctly remember seeing Alan Dershowitz in the early 90s condemning, on the network news, condemning racial profiling. This is, when I think of Dershowitz, this is what I think about. Condemning racial profiling of blacks and Hispanics, American blacks and Hispanics in the early 90s. And then I find here after 2003 that he's actually advocating the profiling of Arabs and apparently even advocating the torture of Arabs. And I relate to Dr. Alan Dershowitz as being a liberal in the early 90s. And then after 2003, all of a sudden he is a right-wing conservative. And I was wondering, is there really a liberal and a conservative element in the U.S. when it comes to Israel, or is it just groups that are pro-Israel that pretend to reflect the right and the left? And could you respond to that, sir?
Well, there's ample precedent for this kind of hypocrisy. So you take the case of American communists during the 1930s and 40s, who were the strongest supporters of civil liberties here. That's a fact. And they were the strongest supporters of the rights of unions, and they were the strongest supporters of equality of blacks and whites. So on the American scene, they had a very progressive agenda. Whereas when it came to the Soviet Union and the atrocities that occurred inside the Soviet Union, they were complete apologists for it. In the case of Alan Dershowitz, when it comes to Israel and anything having to do with Israel, he's a complete apologist like the Stalinists were in the 1930s. But on a domestic agenda apart from Arabs, when it comes to women, blacks, gays, and so forth, he's a typical liberal. But that's not unusual. There's, as I said, precedent for it.
Professor, in the final minutes that we have, can you tell us what's the best solution, in your opinion, to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
Look, the best solution to any conflict is, in my opinion, interstate conflict, is to eliminate states, which I think are the cause of an awful lot of unnecessary hatred and conflict in the world. But the best solution, obviously, is not on the agenda, certainly not in my lifetime. And so we have to look at basically the least worst solution. The least worst solution, it seems to be what's called a two-state settlement. Israeli sovereignty within the June 1967 borders, Palestinian sovereignty within the West Bank and Gaza. If Israel has gone so far and created so many facts in occupied territories that creating a realistic Palestinian sovereignty in the West Bank and Gaza is no longer possible, then obviously the only alternative is one state for both of them.
Do you think that will happen?
Nothing happens of its in politics. Nothing happens of its own of its own accord. People have to organize. People have to mobilize. People have to make things happen.
But do you think the Palestinians have time, though? Because what Israel had done with building the wall, and they choked the life out of the Palestinian economy.
Look, Israel does what Israel does. That's a given. The question is what the Palestinians will do. Unfortunately, Palestinians have probably the worst imaginable leadership. Everybody there is bought off. Everybody there is corrupt. Everybody there is in the American-Israeli pocket. Had the Palestinians had a decent leadership, in my opinion, it would not have been difficult at all to fight the wall. The wall was a case where the International Court of Justice supported them, the United Nations supported them, all human rights organizations across the wall, across the spectrum supported them. They had a huge amount of support. They had many opportunities, but their so-called leadership is bought and paid for by the Americans and the Israelis.
Well,
they're a gang of corrupt.
What could this leadership have done that it did not do? What is at their disposal that they could have done?
Well, I would put their question in reverse. What did they do? They did absolutely nothing with the World Court decision. At a bare minimum, they could have organized millions of Palestinians to go with hammers and chisels.
What would you have done if you were in their position?
I'm saying right now, you could have organized millions of Palestinians to go over to the wall and start breaking it down on the grounds that the International Court of Justice said the wall was illegal under international law, and that there was a responsibility of the international community to take affirmative action in order to prevent the wall from being continued and to tear down what's already been put up. The Palestinians could have had the support of the whole international community if, on their own, they proceeded to knock down the wall. But their leadership did nothing. In fact, their leadership's claim was, we're not a liberation organization anymore. We're a state. Yeah, sure. In their fantasy world, Palestinians and their supporters have to be, honest with themselves and recognize that there have been numerous opportunities to mobilize public opinion, mobilize popular opinion, to turn the tide. They've done absolutely nothing. And this pitiful excuse, well, Israel does this and Israel does that. Well, of course Israel does this and Israel does that. That's Israel. That's the given of the equation. The variable is you. What are you going to do to fight it? And unfortunately, they have a leadership which, as I say, is in fact collaborators with Israel.
Okay.
And we shouldn't shy away from saying that.
Professor, we only have half a minute. Professor, we only have half a minute left in the program, and I just wanted to say thank you, and this was an honor to have you on the program. Thank you, sir, for being with us tonight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we only have a few moments left, actually 10 seconds to say we will be back here in 5 minutes. We will be talking with Jennifer Lowenstein. Be back here. 5 minutes.